Well, it may be a surprise for some people, I think, when they get to know me, and for others probably not. But I have spent most of my life feeling like I don't quite fit in or belong. And my guess is that most of you have had a similar feeling at some time in your life. And indeed, many of us know that feeling so well, what it's like to not fit in or not belong, that we may find it easier to describe how it feels to not fit in versus what it feels like to fit in. And for me, growing up, that feeling of not fitting in seemed to center around usually being, I think almost always being the only one in my classroom who had red hair, and then also being pretty quiet and shy at the same time. And then as I moved into high school, it had more to do with just not being interested in what a lot of my friends were getting involved in. And even today, there are times when I kind of feel like I'm maybe a little bit on the outskirts of things, when peers in ministry don't understand what I do because I'm not in the same kind of setting that they are in, or even on the clinician therapeutic side of my life, they don't always quite understand what I do since they have the spiritual aspect to it. And I'm guessing that pretty much everyone in this room, we could go around and share stories of those times where we didn't feel like we belonged, whether it was in family or friend groups, or maybe even those times when you feel like you don't even fit or belong in your own skin. And that isolation, for me growing up, a lot of times played itself out by getting lost and spending time with my dogs or reading or watching TV. But we also know that for many others, that feeling of not belonging and isolation leads to drug and alcohol use. It can be a way of trying to fit in, and it can be just as much a way of numbing out the pain of not being able to figure out how to belong, to be recognized and noticed with care and compassion. And so we come to our reading this morning, and it's all about figuring out how to fit in to this world. But this passage that David read earlier is actually a prayer. And it's a prayer out of concern and love for the disciples. But I also think it's a prayer for us. This prayer recognizes that it's hard to be in this world at times. And this is a tension that most of us feel throughout our lives. How to live into who we are and how to live into a relationship with God, and yet at the same time figure out how to live in this world which is often at odds with the other two. One of the spiritual mantras that has had a strong impact on me for years as a person coming out of a Christian tradition is from Teresa of Avila. And she wrote, "Christ has no body on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which the compassion of God looks out on a hurting world. Yours are the feet with which God goes about doing good. And yours are the hands with which God is to bless now." And I have taken this mandate or this mantra pretty seriously in my life and believe that I am called to be the hands and feet of God in a hurting world as best as I can. But at other times you hear those words and that just sounds like such a tall order. And there are most days that I can have those thoughts of, I really wish you would have left those duties and responsibilities in more capable hands than mine. And I'm guessing I'm not the only one who has felt that way. And so our reading brings us to, I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world. Well, I'm guessing most of us wouldn't mind the idea of, at least at times, getting to kind of live inside of some little protective bubble, but we do belong to the world. And if we are honest with ourselves, most of us don't want out of the world, and we're very much in it. We are up to our necks in it. So as best as I can tell, we're in the world and we are of the world. I remember hearing a talk from Rick Ufford Chase, who is a social justice worker and advocacy worker, talk about sharing resources and by sharing our resources, learning to trust that God will provide. And I remember that feeling of completely agreeing with him, and yet also that fear of what would really happen if I did that. What would really happen if we shared all of our resources with one another, and if I could actually live like that? And where I often land is that I am in the world and I am of it, and I can't seem to extricate myself. But as I read and reflected on this passage this week, I don't think that these words that we hear are a mandate for us, because these words weren't actually said to us, and instead they are offered up as a prayer. And so if we can move from that place of thinking that we have to get all this figured out and we have to be able to do it perfectly, and instead allow ourselves to get on our knees, lift up our faces, bow our heads, open our arms, whatever prayer looks like for you, and talk to the God of each of our own understanding, what it means to be not in this world yet in this world, then I think it becomes a time of practicing humility. Maybe even being honest with ourselves about some of our deepest yearnings. That yearning to live our lives in sync with God's will for our lives. I can't get this done on my own, but I can turn my fears and my failures over to God's care. I can also get really honest with myself and with my God about my deepest longings and my truest desires. And this is my prayer: to learn how to be in this world, but not of the world. And instead to be in sync with what is God's call for me in this world. I think that one of the challenges in early recovery is exactly this. How can I still be in the world, but hopefully not still of the world as you've known it? So what does this look like? Well, it's learning how to practice and live into the spiritual principles of this program. Some of you may have seen, or maybe you even have, one of the t-shirts that we've had in the bookstore that says, "It ain't them." And I love this logo because it's that reminder that the cunning and baffling nature of this disease of addiction turns the focus of blame outward into a way of increasing our own isolation and disconnection. The solution is changing that focus of blame and justification into spiritual practices of honesty and humility. Learning how to be of service to others while allowing the God of your understanding to begin a spiritual transformation within you. And when this takes hold and begins to blossom, then I think we are beginning to learn how to live in the world and not completely of the world. The Big Book talks about this in the chapter Working with Others. Our rule is not to avoid a place where there is alcohol if we have a legitimate reason for being there. You will note that we made an important qualification, but be sure that you are on solid spiritual ground before you start and that your motive in going is thoroughly good. Do not think of what you will get out of the occasion. Think of what you can bring to it. But if you are shaky, you had better work with another alcoholic instead. So this prayer that's a part of our reading this morning, I think is more about us getting spiritually fit so that we can be of service to others with healthy intentions versus of what it might bring us. And maybe this prayer is a deep desire for us to get to that place in our lives when we too desire to live into God's will for our lives versus our own self-will. And so how do we who long to be in the world, but not so much of the world, find that spot where we aren't being judgy or pointing fingers at others? Well, I think that's again where we get to practice love. We love perhaps the way Jean Vanier, a beautiful theologian and humanitarian, described love, is to love someone is not, first of all, to do things for them, but to reveal to them their own beauty and value, and to say to them through our own attitude, "You are beautiful, and you are important, and I trust you, and you can trust yourself." We all know well that we can do things for others and in the process crush them, making them feel like they are incapable of doing things by themselves. And we know for the family and the friend side of this disease that is often how it works. It has its own cunning and baffling part for family. But to love someone is to reveal to them their capabilities for life, that light that is already shining within them. None of us create that light for one another, but we can help people discover that light that is already within them. This prayer from our reading is just that. It's a prayer that helped to reveal the beauty in the disciples and the beauty that is in us. Not in their ability or strength or perfection, but their beauty. And there's one more piece to this thing about beauty. I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. And I just want us to make note that it doesn't say protect us from evil or protect us from bad things happening, because this brings us to a crucial place where I think many of us can struggle with the issue of who God is and whether we're protected from bad things happening, or even whether God causes those things to happen. And it can be a tough conversation to have when we start talking about ways to be in the world where we do have cancer and we have car accidents and we have addiction and we have homelessness, we have natural disasters. But not to be of the world in the way that we try to make sense of all of it and find those answers. For me, my spiritual journey and understanding of who God is for me is that God doesn't sow cancer cells into people's bodies and doesn't cause those accidents, doesn't cause planes to fly into buildings, or prescribe one child to live in horrendous conditions while another one gets a warm, soft bed at night. And this is sometimes a hard concept to talk about, but because I believe that God is love, then God does not choose to control us like marionettes. I remember a time when I was about 6 or 7, I had this great Barbie doll village that I had built. And I was playing in there and thinking about, are we just God's global Barbie doll village? Is that all we are? That we can be manipulated and moved around? And I came to the conclusion that we weren't. So there must be something more to who we are and who we are called to be in this world. Now, I suppose God could manipulate and control us to suit God. But instead, how I understand God is that God yearns for our love and our desire to be connected to God. And God yearns for that love and desire so much that God has cut the strings. So it's us that have to decide to turn our self-will over to God's care. Understandably, every single one of us in this room wants things to go smoothly for us and others. And at times we can associate good things with God, and there are other times when we've experienced deep wounding that we associate God with that pain and that suffering. But God is also present in our suffering. And when we all face those difficulties, those things that are manageable and some of those that are overwhelming and unmanageable, we have this prayer to help shed some light on this understanding. Because this prayer isn't about a bubble of safety around us so that nothing bad or painful can happen in our lives, but instead that God is with us through the joyous times and also with us through the difficult and trying times. Light exists as well as shadow. Creation has not only a positive but also a negative side. In creation there is a yes, but there is also a no. Not only a height, but also an abyss. Not only clarity, but also obscurity. Not only beginnings, but also endings. In our human existence, there are hours, days, and years, both bright and dark. We have success and failure and laughter and tears and youth and age and gain and loss, birth and sooner or later death. And I know that we label those in the depths of despair prayers in active addiction as foxhole prayers. We all know what we're talking about when we say a foxhole prayer. But I really think there's something else to those prayers. Because we find ourselves seeking out God in that darkest, shadowy side in a deeply pure form. Even if it doesn't last, or even if those pleadings go away in the morning light, I still think there is something pure about those prayers of despair in that moment. And when we have the ability to look back on those dark nights of the soul, we can recognize that God was with us and have even more gratitude about the light that does come into our lives today. Those moments can help remind us to let go of the unnecessary disquiet and disconnect. There is a place of relief and of gratitude when we can recognize and connect with God in both the light and the shadow of our lives. Those gratitudes that we shared this morning in the prayers of the people, we feel them more fully because we've experienced the absence of them and we've experienced the hurt. This amazing fellowship that we are all invited to be a part of teaches us that we can have an active role in the world and learn to love God, ourselves, and one another deeply enough that we don't have to be of the world. And instead we find ourselves of God, and we find ourselves of a spiritual life and recovery. We can love, and wherever we find ourselves as individuals in this fellowship, we can say to someone else, in this place and in this program, I will love you until you can learn to love yourself. This world can be a difficult place, but this fellowship teaches us we don't have to go it alone. A relationship with God and with this fellowship is about not having to face those struggles alone. And it offers support to help flourish in life. God has promised to be with us amid any challenges so that we don't just have that sense of, I'm surviving, but I'm also living into abundance. And God intends to use us wherever we are to work for the good of this world that God loves so much. So all of us, whether this week brings challenges or blessings or some measure of each, God will continue to be with us, strengthening us and ready to use us to care for each other and for this world. So I invite you to be open this week in recognizing how God may want to use you, how God may want to use you to help make this world a more trusting and loving place. It might be through being a good friend or family member, listening to someone else's struggle, standing up for someone who is vulnerable, or doing your best at whatever task lies before you, and even praying for those in need. And I would love to hear how God is working through you this week. God is at work in us and through us for the sake of this very beloved and broken world. And this week, we are again invited to take part in God's unfolding plans for us. Amen.